Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to another conversation. I'm calling Conversations with the Wise, Insights and Practices for Difficult Times. And it's a real pleasure to have as my guest this time, Frank Ostaseski, a friend of many years and one of the most respected names in the field of death and dying, a teacher to many. He's written a wonderful book called Five Invitations that's come out this last year. Co-founded Zen Hospice Project, and is also the founder for Metta Institute, an organization that trains people to be with those who are dying or with others caregiving for the dying. So Frank, first, welcome. So nice to have you here.
It's sweet to be with you, James. Always nice to be with you. I always learn a lot when I'm in a conversation with you.
Back at you. So as you know, that I've been having these conversations with the wonderful friends that I know, respected teachers from all different areas, and just trying to sort out as much for myself as well as for others who might be benefiting, just how we're all navigating these crazy times and trying to stay sane and positive and motivated, wanting to ask people what they're doing, what kind of practices you're actually using in your daily life, and that maybe others might benefit to hear. So first, want to ask you, what's your wisest perspective that helps you hold these current chaotic, uncertain times filled with so much fear, divisiveness, insecurity? How do you hold it so that you don't get overwhelmed?
Oh boy, James, it's a hard question to answer because first of all, I want to be able to say, oh, I never get overwhelmed. But in fact, I do. I get overwhelmed all the time. Mm-hmm. In the sense that sometimes I'm flooded with feeling and thought and all manner of things that, have an impact on my body, heart, and mind. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. So the first truth is I do get really swept away sometimes. But, when I'm afraid, and I'm sure that you do this all the time, when I'm afraid, I often know that I'm afraid. And that means that the part of me that knows I'm afraid is not so afraid. And I can orient to that part, or I can orient to the fear. So fortunately, over many years of practice, I've gotten some more skills at orienting toward the awareness rather than the content of my awareness. And so that's helpful, I think. I think also just it has to do with what our capacity is for uncertainty. Like how well do we tolerate it? I have a granddaughter who's 2.5 years old, and when I play peekaboo with her, she loves it, and she's surprised every time. I can do it 10,000 times, and she's surprised every time. But I often find that when you throw an adult a surprise party, they ask the question like, who's responsible for this? So I think we have to really look and see what our tolerance is for uncertainty, and surprise is a way, or how we react to surprise is a way to understand that. It shows us where we are fluid and flexible and where we are maybe exercising a little too much control, So for me, that's a really big one, I am like everybody else. I want to control what's uncontrollable, But one of the things about being with folks who are dying that's been my work for the last 30 years is that, we look for security, we look for, predictable outcomes, we look for happy endings. But what we're given is uncertainty. And we're more aware of it now, perhaps, but it's always been a characteristic of the human existence. Yeah.
So, okay, given that uncertainty is the fact of life, and I hear when you say that you move as best you can to the awareness that knows that there's fear or overwhelm or whatever, and that's a really Yeah, that's one of the gifts of mindfulness. But
Mm.
let me ask you, I know for myself, sometimes I can I can know that I'm kind of freaking out or getting really outraged, but the hormones and the
Yeah.
body system has gotten so activated that it's hard to just maintain that bird's eye perspective of, oh, it's just freaking out happening. When that happens and you get overwhelmed and your whole being is activated, what do you do to kind of come back to that perspective, not only conceptually
Right.
but embodied?
Yeah, great question. There's a beautiful quote by Pema Chodron that I always loved. There's all these fancy teachings out there, but I like her. She said when she was 6 years old, she was walking down the street, kicking a can, feeling lonely and grumpy and grouchy, and this old woman was sitting there on a bench in sunshine. She said to her, "Little girl, don't you go letting life harden your heart. Don't you go letting life harden your heart." And I just love that. It's one of the best teachings I ever heard. So I think that's a really important reminder that no matter what's happening in the world, and there certainly is plenty to get overwhelmed by. I don't want to let it harden my heart, because then I can't be of any use to the world in some way. So for me, it means settling back in sometimes, into this body and really feeling how much it hurts in response to the world and how scared it is and how confused I am. And when I really allow that, I understand that I can be kind to myself, and that kindness sometimes is stepping back from the world. I need to turning off the news or getting off my devices, and turning my attention towards something that's really life affirming. Those are all things that I do. Here's an example. When I was running Zen Hospice, we were in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and often I had 20 or 30 people who were dying in a week, and it was overwhelming. These were people I knew and cared for. So I did three things. The first thing I did was come back to my cushion, as you suggested, and there we can ground a little bit, and we can remember what we know, and who we are. Yeah. So that was useful. But the other thing I did was I went to a body worker once a week. And this body worker, I would lay on his table, and he wouldn't do a whole lot of massage or something. He just put his hand like that. He'd say, "Where?" And I'd say, "Just here on my shoulder." And he'd touch my shoulder, and I'd cry for about an hour. And there was something about this physical contact and also the relational quality of being with him that really helped me. It just let me cry. And it was a physical experience. There was no talking my way through it, And I would get up and I'd say, "See you next week." And I'd come back next week and do the same thing. The third thing I did was I went to the hospital where I had some friends who were nurses in the maternity ward. And I used to hold babies who were born to addicted mothers in a rocking chair. And I used to do this for about an hour before I would go home to my own children, after a day of working at the hospice. And there was something about being able to soothe that one baby, in the midst of all the madness and craziness and all the death and grief that was happening for me, that was incredibly helpful, to know that I can do this. This I can do, yeah. And so those three things, centering myself, being relational and in contact with the body, and also doing something that really I could accomplish, where I could be successful, where I could have an impact. Those were things that were invaluable to me. And I think we have to find that for ourselves now. What is it that works for us now?
So, along with the centering yourself, and it sounds like when that body worker put his hand on your shoulder, that there was also a discharge there as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you were crying. So
right.
That sounds like it's a really valuable thing to somehow get out all of that stored up tension or fear or stress.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, I don't know about you, but in my body, my heart, my mind, it seems to hold on to tension really well. And basically until it's completed in some way, until it's addressed, it just stays there. It just festers there. And so I have to do something that actively engages it, and being aware helps, of course, but also, as you say, discharging sometimes is really necessary. So I had to self-soothe, and I have to also find a way to soothe the world. Those things are both important. And then do really life affirming things. Like I used to swim in the bay, because it's cold, and life affirming, actually.
That'll chill you out, huh?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So that swimming is another release too, a physical release, and connecting to the earth at the same time.
Yeah, I think you're really pointing us to something that's really important, to really that we can actually discharge some of this, and we can not just discharge it physically. We can let go mentally and emotionally as well. We don't have to hold on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We don't have to.
Well, let me ask. That's all really great and valuable. There are thoughts that get activated.
Uh-huh.
So often with me, it's I can't believe this.
Yeah.
And they can also easily lead to ill will at times.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've seen for myself is that even though it seems it's legitimate and justified, and when there's people doing hurtful things to other people out of greed or out of hatred, that I myself try to keep from getting caught up in that poisonous state of ill will and wishing somebody ill. And I wonder, I have a sense that might be something important to you as well. And I wonder, how do you work with that when ill will comes up, besides just collecting and jumping in the bay and chilling out? In your mind, how do you hold so that there's not more?
Oh God, it's so hard. One of my teachers, who you knew, he said something beautiful to me. He said, "Frank, if you're that right, you're wrong." In other words, when I'm really holding to a view, to a perspective, even if it's a seemingly world healing one, and I'm holding others out, keeping them out of my heart in a way, then I'm wrong. Then it's pretend. It's not real. I mean, it's on its way to being real, but it's not there yet. So that for me, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's really hard, right? And we're really a polarized society right now, and there's an awful lot of horrific things happening. And at the same time, I have this idea, the Vajra energy that can come through. Vajra energy meaning that cutting through energy,
Mm-hmm.
and it, that Vajra doji, that the Tibetans use. It has this. It has this quality of diamond-like in that it's, indestructible, and it also has an incredible force. And I have the sense that something like that is cutting through our culture right now, and it's really hard to be around. It's fierce, and it's cutting through and showing us our racism and showing us our misogyny, and it's tough. And in the process of responding to it, at least for myself, I am humbled, and I will stumble a lot in the course of that. But I see something bigger happening, and that helps me a lot to see that this isn't just, random chaos, that there's something bigger that's coming through that I have more confidence in, actually.
Can you just speak a little bit more? I hear you say there's something that's cutting through, that's showing us where we're stuck and where we're caught. Talk about the confidence that you have, or what just say a little bit more about what that force is.
Well, it's almost like a rising up that seems to be happening. I mean, yesterday in all over the country, different parts of the world. We had another Women's March in which there were hundreds of thousands, millions of women and men walking all over the world. And there were no leaders. It was just rising up out of the good hearts and the, compassionate hearts and bright minds of millions of people, And that's hopeful to me, truly hopeful, not just, wish fulfilling, but really hopeful that that's happening. And so at the same time, while there is all this divisiveness and insanity, frankly, there is also this. And for me, it's really important to keep saying, oh, there is also this, And it's not like, let's see, how can I say it? It's not like it's a lollipop and it's going to fix everything, It's actually there right alongside. And it's they're working together, this mad insanity and this divisiveness, and it's bringing forward this kind of incredible mobilization, I want to say. Here's an example that I would use. In natural disasters, and we've seen plenty of them recently, here in California especially, one of the things that happens is that it isn't necessarily the systems that come to the rescue for everybody, although the systems have been remarkable, first responders, et cetera. It's neighbors. It's people coming and helping each other. When we're sick and maybe facing death, it's the same thing. We think the healthcare system is doing all the work, but in fact, most of the care is happening from friends and family, And so one thing that can happen in these kind of disasters, it can show us that indeed, this has always been here, and it gets mobilized sometimes by really difficult conditions like the ones we're facing in our world today. Mm-hmm. But it's already there. It's already there. Yeah.
So the suffering and the chaos and the intensity of the times is. It sounds like you're saying it's calling forth something good in us that's responding to that.
I think so, and I think that doesn't mean it will be easy, or that it will be fixed quickly. But here's the thing. Suffering and compassion, they rise up together. Not much contact with suffering, not much compassion, really. And so, I think that's what's really happening for us is we're actually turning toward the suffering now as a culture. As much as some of us want to stick our heads in the sand, we can't actually, because it's all around us. And so I think that's evoking this sort of compassionate response, along with other things. It's going to evoke anger and frustration and all manner of other things as well, of course. Yeah.
So in the bigger scheme of things, you said a little while ago, you have confidence. Do you see this? Where do you see this leading in the best case scenario? Of course, it can go any which way. As I've quoted here before, Roger Walsh's statement: "We're in a race between fear and consciousness." And, in the best case scenario, where consciousness keeps winning out, or eventually might win out. What do you envision as the?
Oh boy, it's hard to predict these things, but well, again, I'm going to refer back to my work with folks who are dying, because it's where I learned the most. That they were my best teachers. I work with a lot of folks who lived on the streets. I changed diapers on park benches behind City Hall. And I worked with people who had no inner life and no spiritual practice per se, at least not a professed one. And they made remarkable openings. They were facing something that seemed unbearable to them or unimaginably difficult. And yet oftentimes they met it in remarkable ways. They found within themselves the resources, the compassion to meet the impossible in extraordinary ways. Now, sometimes that happened in the final weeks or days, even minutes of their life. And we might say, too late. And I would tend to agree. It's too late to start then. But what's true is if it's possible then, well, then if that possibility for transformation exists then, well, then it exists now, you know, and we can move toward it. We can call on it now. I think, you know, and this brings us into another subject, but I think one of the pieces that's most important here is our relationship to hope and true hope, or what I call mature hope, is really what's, I think, called for now. Yeah, action, of course, but grounded in something like true hope or mature hope. And I think that's different than what we normally think of hope.
How is a quote that I love from Seneca, the Roman philosopher? He says, "We cease to be afraid when we cease to hope, because hope is always accompanied by fear." And on one level, that other kind of hope, oh, I hope the worst doesn't happen, is kind of almost there's fear intrinsic in that hope. And how is mature hope different from that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, you know, and here's the problem with such words, is that we've bantered them around and, you know, neutered them oftentimes in the course of our discussions. But, you know, I think it's a subtle, we could say, attitude of heart and mind hope, you know. I think it's an essential resource for this human life. And it's the ingredient, we could say, that provides the motivation for us to get up in the morning and get out of bed, you know, and go about our days. You know, it's what Desmond Tutu talked about when he said, you know, it's the light that shows itself even in the darkest of times, right? But, you know, hope can take us beyond the rational. And that can be extraordinary because it enables us to survive sometimes. But it also can be, as you suggest, a kind of cause for delusion, you know? And we have to be mindful of that, I think. To discern the real value of hope, of what I call mature hope, I think we have to draw a line between hope and expectation. You know, we have to, hope is a kind of optimizing force that leads us toward harmony, I would say. But it doesn't arrive from the outside. It doesn't impose itself on us. It arises from within us. So it has an active daring to it, I'd say. And the usual kind of hope that we have is wishful thinking. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's hope guised, or expectation rather, guised as hope. You know, it's fixated on a specific outcome, and it gets conflated with results, and it gets so object focused, right? So outcome focused. So attaching our hope or attaching our happiness to that is just a cause of suffering. It's not really hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just remembering Joanna Macy, who's just such an inspiring figure. She wrote a book not too long ago called Active Hope, and she said for years she hated the word hope. She didn't want to go near it because it just seemed too airy-fairy, and it's going to work out just fine. But when she redefined it for herself as having a vision and just doing what you can to help bring forth that vision, without the expectation, without looking and seeing, are we there yet? To just feel the fulfillment of moving towards that vision, and in the process inspiring others. Well, she came out writing a book. Okay, I'll write a book on active hope, as much as I hated that word for because
it's a great book, and it's well worth reading, I'd say, to people who are listening to this. Mm-hmm. You know, for me, you know, I tend to agree with Joanna. You know, I had a similar relationship to hope, I think. You know, for me, hope, or mature hope, what I call mature hope, maybe it's similar to what she calls active hope. It requires this clear intention, but also simultaneously letting go. And it involves embracing uncertainty, not trying to manage uncertainty, you know. And it's really the hope in the potential of our awakened response, and in something intrinsic in us that can come forward and respond. You know, I was at the hospice one day, and there was a woman, and she was eating watermelon, a lot of watermelon. Every day she ate a watermelon. Mm. And one day I stopped in and I said, "Boy, you must really like watermelon, you know?" And she said, "No, actually, I don't like it so much. But my husband thinks it's really good for me and my cancer. And it makes him really happy if I eat it. So I eat it every day." Mm-hmm. And like big watermelons every day. You know? So I let this go for a few days. And then I went to her husband. I said, "Hey, you know, I'm curious about that watermelon thing." And he said, "Oh, it's fantastic. It's part of the cure." And this is a woman who's weeks from death. And I said, "Wow, I'd like to learn about that." And he said, "Okay." And I said, "Can you show it to me where you found it?" He found it on the internet, you know. And he very excitedly, you know, brought me to the website and showed me this thing about watermelon and he began to read it out loud to me. And as he read it out loud to me, he understood that he had misread it the first time. And really what it said was watermelon can help hydrate people, and hydration is useful when people have cancer. But he was so hopeful of a particular outcome that it distorted his view. It even distorted how he read it, you know, and what he understood from it. And he was just devastated. He was totally devastated because his hope was dashed in that moment, you see. And of course, that wasn't my intention. And then I asked him, you know, after a little while, of course, I asked him, I said, "You know, if your wife only has a few more days, you know, what would you hope to convey to her?" And he said, "Oh, without a pause, James," he said, "Oh, I would want her to know how much I love her and how beautiful she is and how grateful I am for our relationship, you know. That would be most important to me." And I said, "Sounds good," you know. And watermelon dreams went away, and something really deep within him came forward, actually. Not the wish for a certain outcome, her not dying, but in fact, the deep, deep, deep wish to convey his love to her. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's mature hope, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're also touching on something that I think is quite relevant for all of us in these times, and that is, besides whatever actions are done to want to make a difference, that it's about the connection between us and those around that can express our caring and express our love and express our mutual hope for a better world. That's where the magic comes from, as far as giving us energy to want to do something positive.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who runs health clinics in Northern California where the fires were just recently, and it was outstanding what these first responders did. These, you know, people whose own houses were burning, and then they came to care for other people, and how strangers befriended each other, and how, you know, the best was coming forward of people in this disaster, even though they were in devastating circumstances. You know, I think. This is one of the ways that we touched our deepest belonging, is when we're facing the greatest odds, you know, against it. You know, the devastation or the divisiveness that you spoke about when we first began. Yeah. So I think that we connect with something, a kind of a deep belonging that becomes a resource for us, so that we aren't completely overwhelmed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's something also about when things get really tough and dicey and the chips are down, the armoring also comes down because there's much more vulnerability, and so in that vulnerability, hearts can touch each other that much more.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to say it.
Walking around in our own silo of fear.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to talk about it, James. I mean, it's like the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, you know. Of course, what makes that possible is the presence of compassion, which is bantered about a lot in our culture, but I just think of it as a natural human capacity, that comes as a kind of guidance when there is suffering. And it's not just empathy. It's not just I feel with you. It's the actual deep wish to do something to alleviate the pain. And often that first requires, as you suggest, staying with the experience that feels so vulnerable or fragile or difficult. And then because something's there, because compassion's there, whether it's compassion for ourselves or our compassion for another, the defenses against the suffering relax, or they come tumbling down, as you suggest. And then, in fact, the compassion can enter. The compassion can actually see what's actually most needed, and it doesn't just offer cliches then and rhetoric. It actually can make a really substantial intervention. Yeah. I mean, I work with folks who are dying, and dying doesn't feel safe to people. And, a lot of times we think compassion is about making people feel safe. But in point of fact, what happens is when people sense, if I'm really abiding in my compassionate heart and people sense that, then they're willing to go to really dangerous places in their lives. Not because it will be safe, but because they'll be companioned, And I think the same is true for us. We can do that for ourselves, We can be a compassionate presence for others, and I think we can certainly be it for ourselves. Yeah.
Yes, and when we do have a connection, either in the giving or the receiving, our capacities and our threshold for difficulty and fear is much higher. I can remember reading studies that physiologically it's shown that when you're holding somebody's hand, your capacity for physical pain and emotional pain is much greater. There's something magical about that shared response, that we're in this together, and in that connection is also a field of love and mutual affinity that somehow increases that capacity.
Right. Yes, and so we're not in it alone then, right? We know we're not in it alone. And there's something about that simple touch, as you suggest, I mean, when we would teach people how to change a bed with somebody in it, we'd always try and use two people. One person would actually change the bed and the other would keep his or her hands on the patient. Because it's a scary thing to have the bed changed out from under you when you're feeling vulnerable and weak, So that safe hand, we called it in massage, the safe hand. That's really important. I shared a story with you that but maybe your listeners don't. And our friend, Bernie Glassman, wonderful Zen teacher, he was in Germany. And he was teaching about compassion, and he was using the image of Avalokiteshvara, Tibetan form of compassion, embodiment of compassion. And she often is described as having 1,000 arms. Yes. And in each hand is an ear to hear the cries of the world, and 1,000 arms to respond. And it's a beautiful image. And the man in the audience raised his hand and he said, that's very good. It's a beautiful image, but I only have 2 arms. What should I do? And Bernie said, I'm sorry, you're mistaken. And the man said, no, I'm sure I have just 2 arms. It's clear to me. And then Bernie did something very simple. He had everybody in the audience raise both their hands. And there were 500 people in the audience. 1,000 arms. Yeah. And I think we forget that. And we think that we have to do it all. It's all on our backs, But as Joanna was pointing to in Hope, all we can do is the best we can. We do our piece with as much integrity as we can muster and as much compassion as we can possibly, bring forward, and as much clarity as we can cultivate. And then we let go, But we understand we're in it together.
And that in itself invites others, if you're coming from kindness and love and mutual caring, then that's magnetizing, and others respond.
Yeah.
It's very different if you're coming from anger and hate. Yeah, others will say, "Yeah, me too," but it's not a very sustainable energy.
No.
but
No.
but doing your part to bring your own caring into the world, like Andrew Harvey talks about following your heartbreak,
Yeah.
wherever it happens to be, and you find whether it's your dying aunt or climate change or anything in between, Me Too or Black Lives Matter or what your neighborhood community needs, that you put your energy there out of a sense of a joyful responsibility, just doing something so that you
Yeah.
express that caring, and that in itself is an invitation for others to join you.
That's beautifully said. And you're the joy walla, so, you know something about that joyful exertion. I mean, there's effort that's required, right? In that, but it can be a joyful exertion, turning the wheel with all others, when we started Zen Hospice, we didn't, we were looking for a kind of model, and the people build those hierarchical models, table of responsibilities, et cetera. And I just said, we should just make it a circle, and everybody should be on the circle. And they said, we'll put the patients in the middle. I said, no. We'll put the patients on the circle with us, so the donors are on the circle and the doctors and the patients and, everybody's on the circle together, turning in one movement together, serving each other continuously. And I have a feeling that's what's emerging when we see this. I spoke about at the very beginning that this Vajra energy is coming forward. It's a kind of cutting energy, but I also think there's a kind of leaderless energy that's starting to emerge that we haven't understood before. And maybe the particular kind of leadership that comes forward in our time. And I'm getting old, so I'm not sure I can be much of a leader anymore, but I can sure applaud and cheer on the people who are, coming forward in this way. I'm really encouraged by them. Yeah.
Well, one thing that you and so many who've been around do is just impart your own caring and love and inspire others. And I see it as a kind of rippling effect that it doesn't belong to anyone. It just that energy gets awakened in everyone, one heart at a time. So I know you've awakened many hearts to compassionate action all these years, and it's lovely to see. People tell me very regularly, "Wow, I heard Frank Ostaseski on this clip or this talk, and or read his book, and it's making me want to make a difference in my life."
I hope so. It's good to be of some small service to the world. It feels good, and it serves me to do that. I'm a fear type by nature. I'm aversive. I'm grumpy and critical, and so the balancing factor for that is service. Is really to serve the world, and that's what keeps me on an even keel, or at least some of the time on an even keel. So I serve others to serve myself. It's the way I can stay balanced in the world. It's not a good guy riding on a white horse. This is what I need. I need to do this. I need to serve in order to live a life that feels of value. Yeah.
Well, you use your fear well, and I wouldn't wish it on you, but since you got it, you turned it into something really good.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts? Anything that
No, I mean, I think it is useful to keep a perspective. I mean, look, we are bombarded with information right now, and it's easy to think this is the worst it's ever been. And in some degrees, it is. I mean, when we look at climate change, certainly we can see that. But it's always been uncertain. And I think when we learn to let go into uncertainty, and we see that our nature and the nature of the world is not appreciably different, then the fact that things are not solid or fixed, this becomes a liberating opportunity rather than a threat, I think. And so I think to really step into that uncertainty and to, get familiar with it, sit down with it, have a cup of tea, get to know it really well. I think that's our work right now. And And out of that will come all the guidance we need, the skillful action and the compassionate response and the ferocious use of our rage, the skillful use of our rage. I think that's, we don't want to underestimate that, the strength that's tied up in our rage that the world needs, and we need.
I'm just remembering there's this book, Meeting Your Shadow, and the subtitle is The Hidden Power in the Dark Side of Human Nature. In our anger, in our outrage, in our fear, underneath is just a real caring that when we tap into that softer spot and use the energy of that comes with the anger and the outrage, then we're transforming it into something beautiful.
My friend Joan Halifax, that you know well, we teach together quite a lot, and she has a beautiful meditation which she often uses, in which she speaks about having a strong back, a back of that's fluid and flexible, but also strong, and is characterized by equanimity. A kind of that we need that to be in the world. We need a strong back to be in the world. And then she talks about having a soft front, a compassionate heart, a heart of altruism and love, and it's hard to open our hearts to the world if we don't have a strong back, and so we need that stability and that equanimity and that strength in order for us to have the courage to open our hearts to the world. And may we all find in ourselves the strong back and a soft front.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, thanks so much,
You're
Frank.
welcome.
It's great hanging out with you, and I'm sure many people will take inspiration and comfort in your words.
I hope it's useful. And if people want to read this book you've been talking about of mine, it's called The 5 Invitations. And it's not so much about how to take care of folks who are dying, although it has some clues about that. It's more about what do you learn from being on the precipice of death that has value for the rest of us in living a life of meaning and purpose and value. And, I got to be with a couple thousand people as they died, and they're my teachers, and they taught me really well. And everything that I've shared in the book is really from them. So I'm happy to share it to the world. It's
a beautiful book. And also just mention for those, once again, who aren't familiar, your Metta Institute is such a wonderful organization.
Thank you.
Does such good work. So keep on keeping on.
Okay. Hey, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Good for you. Yeah. Big love. Huh?
Good to be with you.
Thanks, my friend.
Bye-bye.